Prezadas autoridades, senhoras e senhores, boa tarde. Sejam bem-vindos à terceira edição do Fórum de Investimento do Brasil. Sou uruguaio, de coração baiano, mas queria começar a minha fala com umas palavras em portunhol. Do BIGI falamos que o portunhol é o idioma oficial do Mercosul. E com muita, sinceramente, com muita alegria que realizamos pela terceira vez este importante evento junto com o governo brasileiro. Antes de entrarnos no tema central deste painel, gostaria de parabenizar o governo brasileiro, em especial as equipes dos Ministério de Economia, do Ministério de Relações Exteriores e de Apex Brasil, que trabalharam duramente junto com a nossa equipe do BIGI na organização deste evento. Mas, para não dar nó na cabeça dos tradutores, passarei agora para o inglês, dado que temos painel bilíngue e multinacional. It is my honor this afternoon to moderate this conversation with such distinguished panelists and to talk about Brazil's insertion in the global economy. And I would like to briefly give some context to this conversation. Regarding trade, we have two bad news and two good news. Let me start with the bad news. The regions, Latin America and the Caribbean's participation in global trade has remained stagnant for half a century. It's about our share in global trade is about 5%. The other bad news is that our intra-regional trade is about 16%. It's quite low compared to Europe, where it's 60, compared to the NAFTA region or USMCA, where it's 50. But now the good news. Since the 1990s, the region has embarked on what is called the Great Liberalization, meaning that trade between us is tariff-free. 90% of trade is tariff-free. So there has been strong trade liberalization. And we also know, and we've done research at the IDB recently in a flagship report that is coming this year, that trade and openness contribute positively to economic growth. In fact, our empirical studies show that trade liberalization is estimated to have accelerated GDP per capita growth in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 2 decades, on average by 0.6 to 0.7%. So that is all positive. And briefly, Brazil has resumed growth. Brazil is growing again in the past 2 years. Inflation is low, interest rates are low, job creation is on the rise, and there's a very important and necessary pension system reform underway. Brazil exports in 2018 grew by more than 10%, and Brazil receives half of the foreign direct investment of this region. It has also concluded historical trade agreements that were in the making for more than 20 years. Mercosur, European Union, Mercosur, EFTA. So without further ado, I would like to initiate our discussion and give the word to Marcos Troyjo, to the Special Secretary for Foreign Trade and International Affairs of the Ministry of Economy, to give his introductory remarks.
Very good. Thank you very much, Fabricio. I'd like to extend the warmest welcome salutations for everyone attending this Brazil Investment Forum. And also, it is my pleasure to be joined here by the colleagues of our panel. The title of our session here, Fabricio, is Brazil in the global economy, right? And we have to position ourselves. And the way we position ourselves today in a tech-intensive world is we pull out our smartphones and turn on the GPS, right, the global positioning system. So the first thing that I like to do is perhaps zoom out a little bit with our GPS and look at the global economy, where we stand in the global economy today. So I think it would be fair to say that for quite a long stretch of history, from 1989 all the way to the Great Recession and the fall of Lehman Brothers in 2008, the global economy experienced what I like to call deep globalization, a sort of triumph of the West, the notion that liberal economies and global trade would face less and less barriers, that perhaps regional economic integration would also mean political integration, legal integration, and obviously the European Union with its common court in Strasbourg, its common parliament in Brussels was leading the way. I was posted, for example, to the United Nations in the 1990s, and I remember a German friend of mine who said, well, in the future, in all likelihood, we're going to be less German and we're going to be more European. So there's very much this notion that we were really embarking on a deep process of globalization, or hyper-globalization, as we like to call it. We are clearly no longer that. So since 2008 and all the way to the present day, perhaps we're living under a different operational system in the global economy that I like to call deglobalization. Deglobalization here does not mean the full reversal of deep globalization. It basically means that we're taking downturns, that the road has more curves, and therefore you are reducing speed. Deglobalization means deceleration of deep globalization. And of course, there are many phenomena out there. Perhaps the decision by the British to leave the European Union is one of the most significant ones. So we're in the midst of this local contentism trend also that you can witness in industrial policies adopted across the board, which obviously helps to break out some of the paradigms we had before, such as global supply chains. I think, Fabrizio, deglobalization, unlike many observers agree, is not going to be there with us for very long. So it creates a lot of underperformance. So there's something new that's emerging. And once again, I don't want to keep playing this gimmicks or these buzzwords, but probably the world is entering a phase of re-globalization, which does not mean picking up from where we left off deep globalization, but it means different things. It means a global scope according to 4 very important drivers. 1, the United States is and will continue to be a very important architect of the international system. 2, there's an obviously rivalry between the United States and China that is being felt in the global economy. I like, Senator, to call it a rivalry and not necessarily a trade war, because according to your interpretation of what a trade war is, the objective is to annihilate your opponent, and this is clearly not the case here. The most important trading partner, the top trading partner of the U.S. is China. The top trading partner of China is the U.S. Top U.S. destination for FDI investment coming from the U.S. is China. Top destination for Chinese investment is the United States. So there's a lot of interdependence there that I think is to be underlined. And of course, the operational system in which these 2 economic superpowers interacted is changing and is going to change. But it will also project as global influence. That's why it's one of the drivers in reglobalization. Number 3, of course, we are talking about a world in which there's also a competition for standards. What is the kind of labor legislation that you adapt? What is the kind of environmental legislations? How do you approach intellectual property rights? What kind of a 5G motto are you going to embrace? So there's a competition out there that obviously is going to define the contours of the global economy. And the 4th driver, naturally, Fabrizio, is what at Davos you call the 4th Industrial Revolution, or in Germany you call Industry 4.0. I myself like better to name it Economy 4.0 because it sort of breaks away with the partitions between agriculture and manufacturing and services and high tech. So it's a new world. So this is the GPS being positioned in a zoom out fashion so we can get a panoramic view. But if we zoom it down and not only observing the notion of distance but also the notion of time, there's this formulation by the Indian economist Rishi Sharma that I like very much. And he says that in every cycle of 10 years, there is a winner. So for example, the 50s was all about Europe because you had the Marshall Plan, you had the reconstruction of Europe, so the winners of the 1950s were the European countries. The 60s were about the big US corporations in which the techno-structure, executives being more important than shareholders, were there on the top. The 70s were about natural resources. The 80s were about Japan. The 90s were about tech companies. The first decade of this new century, the 2010s, were perhaps about the BRICS, right? Because of their bigger share of the global economy. So what is the winner of this decade that will come to a close in a year and a half? My take is that the winner is the United States. right? I mean, not only does the U.S. keep having 25% as a share of global GDP, but the American stock market represents 55% of everything that's traded at stock market level. 88% of global transactions are settled in the US dollars. About 2/3 of foreign exchange reserves in central banks across the globe are nominated in US dollar terms. So it's clearly one major winner of the past 10 decades. But now let's zoom into Brazil. We come into Brazil. What do you see in Brazil? And it's not a sales pitch. I'm actually repeating a friend of mine who works for one of the most important global consultancies out there, when he says, you look at Brazil and what you see is the most ambitious and comprehensive reform agenda in implementation in the world today. This is what's happening in Brazil. And this transformational agenda, as you've heard from the speech by Minister Paulo Guedes this morning, is made up of five points. Social security reform, which obviously has to do with stopping the past influencing so poorly in the present and the future. Tax reform, and most importantly, the Federative Pact, which is going to reorganize Brazil also from a budget outlook. 3, bringing down the influence of government in the economy. We must kick the state out of an economy that's been driven by it throughout the past 40 years. Number 4, privatizations, concessions. You've heard the numbers. We're going to close this year at about 20 billion government assets being privatized. And of course, the 5th point, which is under part of my purview in cooperation with Ambassador Norberti and our friends at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is opening up Brazil's economy. You have mentioned very correctly that Brazil, Mercosur and European Union have concluded last June 28th, that which is the biggest trade treaty in the history of the economy, either by considering the number of players involved or the geographical scope that it entails. And we're going to keep doing that. We're negotiating with Canada, with Mexico, we're probably going to have, depending on the electoral results in Argentina, also to adjust Mercosur to this new phase. But this is the determination. The message that I wanted to leave at this point is, you think about 4 years ago, Fabrício, everyone said there is a perfect storm coming Brazil's way, either because the global economy does not favor Brazil, either because Brazil is facing the dire effects of a systemic corruption process that has really stagnated Brazil's economy. What we have right now is Brazil putting together the elements for a perfect sunny day. And that's what we're working for. We want to make the 2020s belong to Brazil. Along with our friends and partners, we want the 2020s to have Brazil as a winner. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Troyjo. Ambassador Moretti.
Boa tarde a todos. Cumprimento os meus